In the shadow of ancient stones, where desert winds whisper secrets older than Christianity itself, 9 knights knelt in a circle that would reshape the destiny of 2 civilizations. But what if everything you've been told about their holy mission was a carefully constructed lie? What if their true purpose was not to protect pilgrims, but to plunder the mystical treasures of pharaohs who had been dust for 3,000 years? Picture this: Jerusalem, 1118. The city still bears the scars of conquest, its stones stained with the blood of 3 faiths. In the ruins of Solomon's temple, 9 French knights swear an oath that history records as noble and pure. But in the shadows beyond their torchlight, other figures watch men whose knowledge stretches back to the time when gods walked among the pyramids, when magic flowed through amulets of gold and jewel, when the dead spoke through objects that held the very essence of immortal power. You see, what the chronicles never tell you is this: the Knights Templar didn't just stumble upon wealth and influence through battlefield prowess and banking innovation. They discovered something far more valuable, far more dangerous. In the buried vaults beneath Jerusalem, in the hidden chambers of Alexandria's lost library, in the secret workshops of Cairo's most mysterious craftsmen, they found the magical objects of ancient Egypt, artifacts so powerful that they could grant their wielders abilities that seemed divine. Tonight, we peel back the veil of 7 centuries to reveal the truth about history's most enigmatic military order. This isn't just about medieval knights or religious relics. This is about the theft of supernatural power, the preservation of forbidden knowledge, and the creation of a legacy that continues to influence world events through secret societies that guard ancient Egyptian magic. To this very day, like this video and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Knights Templar, and reveal why the most coveted treasures in human history may still be hidden in places you'd never think to. Look, the morning sun cast long shadows across the ruined stones of Solomon's temple as Hugh de Payens stood before the entrance to chambers that had been sealed since the destruction of Jerusalem by Roman legions over a millennium before. It was the spring of 1119, barely a year since he and 8 other knights had sworn their oath to protect Christian pilgrims. But protection was never their true purpose. De Payens carried with him something that would have meant death if discovered by the church authorities: a map drawn on papyrus, so ancient it crumbled at the edges, inscribed with hieroglyphic symbols that he had learned to read through months of secret study with scholars who claimed their knowledge came from the priests of Memphis and Thebes. The map had come to him through channels that existed in the shadows between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities in the Holy Land, merchants who traded in more than spices and silk, scholars who preserved texts that official libraries would burn, mystics who understood that true power came not from prayer books, but from objects crafted by hands that had touched the divine. Brother Godfrey, de Payens called to his most trusted companion, Godfrey de Saint-Omer. The calculations are correct. The chamber lies 17 steps below the foundation stone, precisely where the papyrus indicates. Godfrey examined the ancient document with the careful attention of a man who had spent months learning to distinguish between authentic Egyptian artifacts and the clever forgeries that flooded the markets of Damascus and Acre. The symbols on the papyrus were unlike anything he had seen in Christian manuscripts, complex combinations of birds, eyes, and geometric shapes that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. "Hugh," he whispered, "are we certain this wisdom comes from God? These symbols, they speak of powers that the Church would call blasphemous." The Payans smiled with the confidence of a man who had already made his choice between orthodox faith and secret knowledge. "The Church calls many things blasphemous that were once considered divine. The pharaohs of Egypt communicated with gods that Moses himself acknowledged as real. Their priests created objects that could heal the sick, reveal the future, and grant their bearers protection that no sword or shield could provide. The expedition into the subterranean chambers beneath Solomon's temple began at midnight, when the other knights of their small order believed their leaders were engaged in private prayer. But prayer was the furthest thing from their minds as they descended stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use, carrying tools that would have seemed strange in any monastery, brass instruments for measuring angles that corresponded to stellar alignments, charts that showed the positions of constellations as they had appeared over Giza 3 millennia earlier, and most importantly, a collection of small objects wrapped in silk that had cost them nearly everything they possessed. These objects were their keys authentic, Egyptian amulets acquired through a network of antiquities dealers who operated in the shadow economy that flourished wherever ancient civilizations had left their traces. A scarab beetle carved from lapis lazuli and inscribed with the cartouche of Thutmose III, an Eye of Horus pendant wrought in gold that still retained traces of the oils and resins used in its consecration. An Ankh cross fashioned from meteoric iron that had been worked by craftsmen whose techniques had died with the last of the pharaohs. The chamber they discovered that night exceeded every promise made by the ancient papyrus. Carved into the living bedrock beneath Jerusalem were alcoves that contained artifacts that should not have existed so far from the Nile. Yet there they were, canopic jars that still emanated an otherworldly coolness despite centuries of abandonment, bronze mirrors that reflected more than mere faces in their polished surfaces, and scrolls of papyrus covered with hieroglyphic texts that seemed to describe rituals for communicating with beings that dwelt beyond the veil of death. "By all the saints," Godfrey breathed, his voice echoing strangely in the ancient chamber, "these are the treasures of pharaohs. But how came they to be here beneath the Temple of Solomon?" The Payans was examining a golden amulet shaped like a falcon, its surface covered with inscriptions so fine they seemed to have been etched by divine hands. As his fingers traced the hieroglyphic symbols, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with body heat, a pulsing energy that seemed to resonate with rhythms older than human heartbeats. "Solomon's wisdom was legendary," he replied, his voice filled with growing awe and understanding. "The biblical accounts speak of his knowledge of all things, his ability to command spirits, his mastery over the natural world. But they don't tell us where such wisdom came from. Perhaps it came from the same source as the power of the pharaohs from gods who walked the earth when the world was young. The objects they discovered that night would change the course of history, though the world would not learn of their significance for centuries to come. Each artifact was not merely decorative or symbolic. They were functional tools created by a civilization that had mastered techniques for focusing and amplifying human consciousness, for accessing information that existed beyond normal perception, for manipulating forces that modern science was only beginning to understand. The Eye of Horus amulets when worn by individuals whose bloodlines carried certain genetic markers, could enhance perception to supernatural levels. The Ankh crosses served as conduits for energy that could accelerate healing and extend human lifespan. The scarab beetles were information storage devices that could preserve knowledge across millennia, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to decode their contents. But perhaps most significant were the book's scrolls, a papyrus bound in covers made from materials that seemed to shift between leather and something altogether more exotic. These texts contained the complete ritual instructions for Egyptian magic, from the simplest protective charms to complex ceremonies for communicating with intelligences that existed on planes of reality and visible to ordinary human perception. "Hugh," Godfrey said, his hands trembling as he examined a scroll that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "If the Church learns of these discoveries, the Church will never learn of them," the Payans replied with absolute certainty. "But we will use them. These objects represent power that the pharaohs wielded to create one of the greatest civilizations in human history. In our hands, guided by Christian purpose, they could establish a new order that spans continents and endures for centuries." That night marked the true beginning of what history would know as the Knights Templar, not the noble protectors of pilgrims described in official chronicles, but something far more ambitious and dangerous, a secret society dedicated to acquiring, preserving, and utilizing the magical artifacts of ancient Egypt for purposes that would reshape medieval Europe and create influences that continue to operate in the modern world. As dawn broke over Jerusalem, the 9 knights emerged from the chambers beneath Solomon's temple, carrying burdens that were far heavier than mere gold or silver. They carried the accumulated mystical knowledge of a civilization that had achieved mastery over forces that Christianity had declared forbidden, powers that could elevate their bearers above the limitations of ordinary human existence. But they also carried the seeds of their own eventual destruction, for the Church that had blessed their formation would one day turn against them with the fury of an institution that discovered its most trusted servants had been practicing arts that predated and challenged Christian authority. The transformation had begun. The objects wrapped in silk and hidden in leather satchels would travel from Jerusalem to Cyprus, from Cyprus to France, from France to England and Scotland and Portugal, establishing a network of hidden power that would influence the development of Western civilization in ways that official historians would never acknowledge. And in the shadows of medieval society, other eyes watched and other hands reached toward the same prizes. For the Knights Templar were not the only organization that understood the true value of Egyptian magical artifacts. Ancient bloodlines that traced their heritage to the priests of Memphis and Heliopolis had survived the conquest of their homeland by Greeks and Romans and Arabs, preserving their traditions in secret while waiting for the proper moment to reclaim what had been taken from them. The stage was set for a conflict that would span centuries, played out in the hidden corners of palaces and monasteries, in the private chambers of alchemists and mystics, in the meeting halls of societies that spoke publicly of philosophy and charity while guarding secrets that could transform human understanding of reality itself. Knights Templar had opened a door that could never again be closed, accessing powers that would make them the most influential and ultimately the most feared organization in medieval Europe. But they had also awakened forces that had slumbered since the last pharaoh was laid to rest, powers that would demand their own accounting when the time of reckoning came. In chambers beneath Jerusalem, in the light of flickering torches, 9 knights had begun the greatest theft in history, not the theft of mere treasure, but the appropriation of divine magic itself, with consequences that would echo through the centuries and shape the hidden history of the world. 3 months after the discovery beneath Solomon's temple, Hugh de Payens stood on the deck of a trading vessel disguised as a merchant pilgrim, watching the legendary lighthouse of Alexandria emerge from the Mediterranean mist. But the ancient wonder that had guided ships for over 1,000 years was not his destination. His true purpose lay hidden in the winding streets of the greatest center of learning the world had ever known, where the descendants of Pharaoh's priests still preserved secrets that could transform mere mortals into beings of supernatural power. The objects he had found beneath Jerusalem were already changing him in ways that both thrilled and terrified his rational mind. The golden falcon amulet he wore against his skin had begun to show him visions during his prayers, not Christian revelations, but glimpses of ancient Egypt in its glory, where priest-kings commanded forces that made the miracles of Christ seem modest by comparison. The Eye of Horus pendant that Godfrey carried had granted him the ability to see in perfect darkness and to perceive the approach of enemies from distances that should have been impossible for human senses. But these were merely hints of what Egyptian magic could achieve. According to the papyrus scroll they had discovered, the artifacts beneath Jerusalem were the least of the treasures that had been scattered across the ancient world when Alexandria fell to Arab conquest. The greatest prizes objects that could grant their wielders abilities that gods themselves might envy were hidden in places where only those who knew the old ways could find them. As the ship approached Alexandria's harbor, de Payens felt the familiar warmth of the falcon amulet against his chest intensify, as if responding to proximity to its place of origin. The sensation was accompanied by images that flooded his consciousness with startling clarity. Underground chambers filled with scrolls that contained the complete knowledge of Egyptian magic. Workshops where craftsmen who carried the bloodlines of ancient priests still created objects that could channel supernatural forces, and most intriguingly, a library hidden beneath the modern city that preserved texts the famous library of Alexandria had never publicly acknowledged possessing. "Master Hugh," whispered Brother Marcus, the youngest member of their expedition, "are you certain we can trust the contacts you've arranged?" The penalty for Christians caught practicing Egyptian magic would be death by burning. De Payens smiled with the confidence of a man who had already tasted power beyond mortal comprehension. "Marcus, the contacts we're meeting are not random merchants or scholars. They are the inheritors of a tradition that spans 3 millennia, guardians of knowledge that was ancient when Moses walked among the pyramids. They have been waiting for us." The meeting had been arranged through channels that existed in the shadows between the official religious communities of the Holy Land. A Coptic priest in Jerusalem had whispered of a scholar in Alexandria who possessed texts that predated Christianity by millennia. A Jewish merchant had hinted at artifacts that could be purchased by those who understood their true value. A Muslim mystic had drawn diagrams that seemed to map the locations of hidden treasures throughout Egypt. All of these leads had converged on a single name, Al-Mansur, ibn Yusuf, a man who claimed descent from the last high priests of Memphis and who was said to possess a collection of magical artifacts that included objects from the personal burial chambers of pharaohs, whose names had been deliberately erased from historical records. The streets of Alexandria assaulted their senses with the cacophony of a dozen languages and the aroma of spices from continents they had never seen. But beneath the surface bustle, the Payans could perceive patterns that his enhanced senses revealed, symbols carved into building, stones that matched the hieroglyphs on his papyrus scroll, geometric proportions in the architecture that corresponded to the stellar alignments marked on ancient Egyptian star charts, and most significantly, people whose faces carried features that seemed to echo the statues of pharaohs and gods that adorned the artifacts in his possession. Their destination was a modest building in the scholars' quarter that served as both library and workshop for those who studied the intersection of ancient wisdom and practical magic. But as they approached the entrance, the Payans realized that their arrival had been anticipated. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a man whose age was impossible to determine, but whose eyes held depths that suggested knowledge accumulated across more lifetimes than any human should possess. "You Payans," the man said in perfect Latin that carried the subtle accent of ancient Greek. "I am Al-Mansur ibn Yusuf, and I have been expecting you since the stars aligned in the configuration my ancestors saw over Memphis 3,000 years ago." The interior of Al-Mansur's establishment defied the modest appearance of its exterior. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled with scrolls, codices, and objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Star charts covered the ceiling, showing constellations as they had appeared over ancient Egypt during the reigns of pharaohs, whose monuments still defied explanation. And everywhere, scattered on tables and displayed in glass cases, were artifacts that made the treasures they had found beneath Jerusalem seem like mere trinkets. "You have already felt the awakening," Al-Mansur observed, his gaze focusing on the spot where the falcon amulet lay concealed beneath the Payans' robes. "The bloodline carries the potential, but the objects unlock the power. Your ancestors came from the same stock that produced the pharaohs, though that heritage has been diluted by centuries of intermarriage with those who lack the genetic keys." He led them to a table where a collection of objects was arranged according to principles that seemed to combine astronomy, mathematics, and something that transcended both. At the center lay a tablet covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions so complex they seemed to move in the flickering lamplight. "The tablet of Thoth," Al-Mansur explained, his voice carrying reverence reserved for the most sacred relics. "Created by the God of wisdom himself, according to the texts my family has preserved since the time of the pharaohs. This single artifact contains the complete instructions for achieving divine consciousness, for transcending the limitations of mortal flesh, for wielding forces that can reshape reality itself." The Payans felt the falcon amulet growing warm against his skin as he approached the tablet. The hieroglyphic symbols seemed to rearrange themselves before his eyes, transforming from indecipherable marks into instructions so clear they might have been written in his native French. It's speaking to me," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and growing terror. "I can understand every symbol, every instruction. It's showing me how to unlock abilities that ... That what, brother?" Al-Mansur prompted with a smile that held both encouragement and warning. "That would make me more than human," Depayens completed, his hand trembling as he reached toward the tablet's surface. The moment his fingers touched the ancient stone, the world exploded into visions that spanned millennia. He saw the construction of the pyramids, but not by armies of slaves dragging massive blocks across the desert. Instead, priest kings, wearing objects identical to those in his possession, were directing the movement of stones through focused will alone, manipulating gravitational forces through techniques that combined mental discipline with properly attuned artifacts. He witnessed ceremonies in temple chambers hidden beneath the Sphinx, where initiates underwent transformations that elevated their consciousness to levels that allowed direct communication with intelligences that existed on planes of reality invisible to ordinary human perception. He observed the creation of magical objects in workshops where craftsmen who had undergone these initiations could infuse gold and jewels with forces that made them conduits for supernatural power. Most significantly, he saw the dispersal of these treasures when Alexander conquered Egypt, when Roman legions marched through Memphis, when Arab armies swept across the Nile Delta. Each conquest had sent currents of initiated priests and their most precious artifacts flowing across the ancient world, carrying Egyptian magical knowledge to every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. "The treasures you found beneath Jerusalem," Al-Mansur explained as the visions faded, "were placed there by priests who fled Egypt during the Roman conquest. They knew that the Temple of Solomon had been built according to principles that our ancestors taught to the builders, that the sacred geometry of its construction would preserve and amplify the power of the objects hidden within its foundations." Brother Marcus was examining another artifact on the table, a staff topped with the head of Anubis, the jackal-headed god who weighed the souls of the dead. As his fingers closed around the weapon, his eyes widened with shock and recognition. "Master Hugh," he gasped, I can actually sense the spiritual condition of everyone in this room. Brother Godfrey carries guilt for doubts about our mission. Al-Mansur's soul holds knowledge that would drive ordinary men to madness. And you ... double quotes. He paused, staring at Depayens with growing amazement. "Your spirit is transforming into something that is no longer entirely human." Al-Mansur nodded approvingly. "The staff of Anubis grants its bearer the ability to perceive the hidden truths that lie behind all human interaction. In the hands of the pharaohs it was used to judge the worthiness of nobles and priests. In your hands it could reveal the secret thoughts and intentions of kings and popes, but the most extraordinary artifact on the table was a simple-appearing Ankh cross made from a metal that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of observation. When Godfrey de Saint-Omer lifted it from its resting place, the room filled with an energy that made every other magical object in the collection respond with harmonious vibrations. The master key, Al-Mansur whispered with reverence that bordered on worship. The Ankh that was carried by the pharaoh Akhenaten when he attempted to transform Egyptian religion into monotheistic worship of a single god. This object can unlock the full potential of any other Egyptian magical artifact, amplifying their power beyond anything their creators originally intended. As Godfrey held the Ankh, the falcon amulet that Depayens wore began to pulse with light visible, even through his clothing. The Eye of Horus pendant around his own neck started generating a soft blue radiance. Throughout the room, dozens of other objects began glowing, humming, and resonating in patterns that created a symphony of supernatural harmonies. Together, Al-Mansur continued, these three objects, the tablet of Thoth for wisdom, the staff of Anubis for judgment, and the master key for amplification, can grant their bearers abilities that rival those of the gods themselves. But they come with a price. What price? Depeans asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. The price of becoming guardians of knowledge that most humans are not ready to understand. The price of wielding power that will make you targets for every force in the world that opposes the awakening of human consciousness. The price of discovering that the religion you have served your entire lives is merely a pale reflection of truths that were ancient. When Christ walked the earth, transformation that began in the chambers beneath Jerusalem was accelerating beyond Depean's ability to control. The magical artifacts were not simply tools to be used. They were catalysts that were fundamentally altering his consciousness, expanding his perception, and granting him access to levels of knowledge that human minds were never designed to contain. But with expanding awareness came expanding responsibility. He could see now that the Knights Templar would become more than a military order protecting pilgrims. They would become the guardians of magical knowledge that could either elevate human civilization to unprecedented heights or destroy it entirely if misused. As they prepared to conclude their transaction with Al-Mansur, purchasing artifacts that represented wealth beyond any earthly treasure, Depeans felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. The objects they were acquiring would make the Knights Templar the most powerful organization in medieval Europe, but they would also make them the most hunted. For in the shadows of Alexandria, other eyes had been watching their meeting. Agents of the Byzantine Empire who understood the true value of Egyptian magic, representatives of Islamic mystical orders who considered themselves the rightful heirs to pharaonic wisdom, and most dangerous of all, emissaries of ancient bloodlines who had never forgiven the theft of their ancestors, treasures by foreign conquerors. The stage was being set for conflicts that would span centuries, fought not with swords and siege engines, but with forces that could reshape reality itself. And at the center of it all, 9 French knights who had thought they were embarking on a holy mission were discovering that they had become pawns in a game whose rules were written by gods. The desert wind carried whispers of ancient curses as Hugh Depeans and his companions approached the Giza necropolis under cover of darkness. Their horses, hooves muffled by cloth wrappings that had been blessed with oils whose recipes predated Christianity by millennia. But they were not alone in the shadow of the pyramids. Other figures moved through the moonlight watchers who had been guarding these monuments since the last pharaoh was laid to rest, and who viewed any attempt to disturb the resting places of god-kings as an act of war against the divine order itself. The magical artifacts they had acquired in Alexandria had transformed the 3 knights beyond recognition. Depeans could now see in perfect darkness, his vision enhanced by the falcon amulet to levels that allowed him to perceive the heat signatures of living beings from distances measured in miles. Godfrey de Saint Omer moved with the fluid grace of a man whose reflexes had been accelerated far beyond human norms, the Eye of Horus pendant, granting him awareness of his surroundings that bordered on prescience. Brother Marcus carried the staff of Anubis with growing confidence, its power to read souls having revealed to him truths about human nature that would have shattered lesser minds, but it was the combined presence of all their artifacts together that created effects none of them had anticipated. When the objects were brought into proximity with the Great Pyramid itself, they began resonating with frequencies that seemed to awaken something vast and ancient that had been sleeping beneath the Giza Plateau for thousands of years. Master Hugh, Marcus whispered, his voice tight with concern, "The staff is showing me spiritual presences throughout the pyramid complex. We are not alone here, and what watches us is not entirely human." The Payans nodded grimly. Al-Mansur had warned them that the greatest treasures of Egyptian magic were protected by guardians who had undergone transformations that elevated them beyond mortal limitations. The keepers, as they were known, were the descendants of high priests who had chosen to extend their lives indefinitely through magical means, becoming eternal sentinels who ensured that the most dangerous artifacts remained safely hidden from those who lacked the wisdom to use them responsibly. Their destination was not the Great Pyramid itself, but the enigmatic Sphinx that crouched in its shadow. According to the papyrus texts they had studied in Alexandria, the lion-bodied monument was not merely decorative, but served as the entrance to chambers that contained the personal collection of artifacts belonging to pharaohs whose reigns had been deliberately erased from official records, rulers who had achieved such mastery over magical forces that their very existence had been deemed too dangerous to acknowledge in conventional histories. The entrance they sought was hidden beneath the right paw of the Sphinx, concealed by mechanisms that would respond only to properly attuned magical artifacts. As the Payans approached the ancient monument, he felt the falcon amulet growing warm against his chest, its golden surface beginning to pulse with light that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. But as he knelt to examine the stone paving beneath the Sphinx's paw, a voice spoke from the darkness behind them, a voice that carried the authority of ages and the chill of the tomb. "You seek that which does not belong to you, children of the northern lands." They turned to see a figure emerging from shadows that had seemed empty moments before. The man appeared to be middle-aged, but his eyes held depths that suggested lifespans measured in millennia rather than decades. His skin had the bronze tone of the desert, but it seemed to gleam with an inner radiance that had nothing to do with reflected moonlight. Most unsettling of all, he moved without making sound, his feet seeming to float above the sand rather than walking upon it. "I am Amenhotep," the figure continued, "keeper of the sacred threshold, guardian of the hall of records, and protector of that which sleeps beneath the dream stone. You carry artifacts of power, but you lack the bloodline and the wisdom to wield them without bringing catastrophe upon both your people and mine." The Payans rose slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the sword at his side, before he remembered that conventional weapons would be useless against a being who commanded the same magical forces. They were only beginning to understand. "We seek knowledge that could benefit all of Christendom," he replied, trying to project authority despite the supernatural dread that the keeper's presence inspired. "The wisdom of ancient Egypt could help us build a new order that serves both God and man." Amenhotep's laugh was like wind blowing across empty tombs. "Your God is young, French knight. The powers you seek to harness were ancient when his prophets first walked the earth, and the men you serve, the authorities who have blessed your mission, would burn you as heretics if they knew the true nature of what you have discovered. The keeper gestured toward the artifacts they carried, and the Payans felt the falcon amulet growing uncomfortably hot against his skin. These objects were created by priest-kings who understood that consciousness itself is the fundamental force of the universe, that properly trained minds can reshape reality through will alone. In the hands of those who lack such training, they become instruments of destruction rather than creation. Then teach us, Godfrey interjected, surprising everyone including himself with his boldness. If we are unworthy, make us worthy. If we lack wisdom, grant us wisdom. Amenhotep studied the three knights with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to examine the very structure of their souls. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. Very well. But know that the path of initiation demands a price that few are willing to pay. To gain access to the Hall of Records, to touch the personal artifacts of pharaohs who achieved godhood through magical arts, you must first prove that you can survive contact with forces that have destroyed lesser minds. He led them to a section of the Sphinx's base where hieroglyphic symbols covered the stone surface in patterns so complex they seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight. As Amenhotep spoke words in a language that predated Egyptian hieroglyphs, the symbols began to glow with the same inner radiance that emanated from their guide. The stone itself became fluid, flowing aside to reveal a staircase that descended into depths that their enhanced senses could not penetrate. But as they began their descent, the Payans realized they were being followed. Other figures had emerged from the desert nightmen whose clothing and weapons marked them as fellow Templars, but whose spiritual emanations, as perceived through the staff of Anubis, carried darkness that spoke of divided loyalties and hidden agendas. Guillaume de Payans breathed, recognizing the leader of the pursuing group. But how did you know of our expedition? Brother Guillaume de Montfort stepped into the light cast by the glowing hieroglyphs, his face bearing the confident smile of a man who held significant advantages over his opponents. He wore artifacts that the Payans didn't recognize, a collar of gold and lapis lazuli that seemed to writhe with serpentine energy, gauntlets that gleamed with metallic surfaces that shifted color like oil on water. Did you think you were the only Templars to discover the true treasures of Egypt, Brother Hugh? While you played in the ruins of Jerusalem, others of us have been building relationships with sources of power that make your amateur discoveries seem like children's toys. The artifacts Guillaume wore were responding to proximity with their own collection. But instead of the harmonious resonance they had experienced in Alexandria, the interaction was creating discord frequencies that clashed and fought like living enemies. These are the claws of Sekhmet, Guillaume continued, flexing his hands to display gauntlets that now extended razor-sharp talons of supernatural metal. Forged for the lioness goddess of war and plague, they grant their wearer the ability to tear through any defense, whether physical or spiritual. Combined with the collar of Apep, which channels the chaotic forces that seek to unmake creation itself, they provide power that your trinkets cannot match. Amenhotep watched the confrontation with the detached interest of someone observing a contest whose outcome was predetermined. So, he mused, the servants of the northern god have already divided into factions. This was foretold in the prophecies carved upon the walls of Dendra. The battle that erupted in the shadow of the Sphinx was unlike anything recorded in the chronicles of medieval warfare. Guillaume's claws of Sekhmet extended into blades of energy that could slice through stone as easily as flesh, while the collar of Apep surrounded him with an aura of destructive force that aged and corroded everything it touched. But the Payans and his companions had advantages that Guillaume's faction had not anticipated. The falcon amulet granted its wearer flight that was indistinguishable from levitation, allowing the Payans to fight from aerial positions that conventional combat training had never prepared his opponents to counter. Godfrey's Eye of Horus provided him with precognitive awareness that let him anticipate attacks before they were launched. Most devastatingly, Marcus wielded the staff of Anubis with growing expertise, using its soul-reading abilities to identify and exploit the spiritual weaknesses of their attackers. The conflict lasted less than 10 minutes, but its aftermath would reshape the hidden history of the Knights Templar. Guillaume and his surviving followers retreated into the desert, carrying with them artifacts whose chaotic energies had left scars on the landscape itself. More importantly, they carried knowledge of the Payans' location and mission, information that would eventually reach ears for whom the Knights Templars' exploitation of Egyptian magic represented an intolerable threat to established religious authority. "You fought well," Amenhotep observed, "but you have also made enemies who will pursue you across continents and centuries." Guillaume's faction represents those who seek to use magical power for domination rather than enlightenment. The conflict between you will continue until one side or the other is completely destroyed. The entrance to the Hall of Records led through chambers that defied every expectation of what could exist beneath the Egyptian desert. Vast spaces carved from living rock, their walls covered with hieroglyphic texts that provided detailed instructions for magical practices that official Egyptian history had never acknowledged. Workshops where artifacts were displayed alongside the tools used to create them, revealing techniques that combined metallurgy, astronomy, and consciousness manipulation in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about what ancient civilizations had been capable of achieving. But the greatest treasures lay in the deepest chamber, where the personal collections of pharaohs who had achieved legendary status were displayed in cases made from crystalline materials that had preserved their contents in perfect condition across millennia. The crown jewel of Pharaoh Khufu was a diadem that incorporated technologies for amplifying human consciousness to levels that allowed direct communication with intelligences that existed on higher planes of reality. The solar disk of Rhea was a golden artifact that could manipulate electromagnetic forces, granting its wielder abilities that ranged from healing to the projection of destructive energy. The resurrection coffer of Osiris was a container that could preserve biological materials in states of suspended animation, effectively granting immortality to those who understood its proper use. These artifacts, Amenhotep explained as they examined treasures that represented the pinnacle of Egyptian magical achievement, were created by rulers who spent their entire reigns preparing for transformations that would elevate them beyond human limitations. They are not mere objects, but tools for achieving apotheosis, the conscious evolution from mortal to divine status. As the Payans lifted the crown jewel of Khufu, He felt his consciousness exploding outward to encompass perspectives that spanned both space and time. He could perceive the construction of the pyramids as it had actually occurred, not through slave labor, but through the coordinated application of gravitational manipulation techniques that allowed massive stone blocks to be positioned through focused mental energy. He witnessed ceremonies in hidden chambers where pharaohs underwent transformations that granted them abilities that seemed supernatural, but were actually the result of systematic development of consciousness potentials that lay dormant in all human beings. Most significantly, he saw the future glimpses of events that would unfold across the coming centuries as the magical knowledge of Egypt spread through secret societies that would influence the development of European civilization in ways that official histories would never acknowledge. The Knights Templar would become more than a military order. They would become the guardians of magical traditions that could either elevate human consciousness to unprecedented levels or destroy civilization through the misuse of powers that mortal minds were barely capable of comprehending. But first, they would have to survive the enemies they had made, not just Guillaume's faction of corrupted Templars, but the forces of Orthodox Christianity that would inevitably discover and oppose their exploitation of magical practices that challenged fundamental religious doctrines. As they prepared to depart the Hall of Records, carrying artifacts that represented power beyond earthly comprehension, Decoding felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. The decisions he made in the coming months would determine whether the magical knowledge of ancient Egypt would be preserved and developed or destroyed by those who feared its implications for established authority. The stage was set for conflicts that would span centuries, fought in the shadows of medieval society between those who sought to preserve ancient wisdom and those who would destroy anything that challenged their understanding of divine authority. In the depths beneath the Sphinx, where pharaohs had prepared for their transformation into gods, 9 French knights had acquired the tools to reshape the world. But they had also awakened forces that would demand an accounting for their presumption in claiming powers that had been reserved for the chosen of the gods themselves. The ship that departed Alexandria's harbor in the winter of 1121 carried cargo that would have terrified every Christian authority in Europe had they understood what lay hidden in the seemingly innocent religious shrines being transported by the Knights Templar. But Hugh de Payens and his companions had learned well the arts of concealment during their months in Egypt, crafting containers that masked the supernatural emanations of their magical artifacts while maintaining the blessed appearance of conventional Christian relics. The crown jewel of Pharaoh Khufu now rested within a shrine dedicated to St. James, its consciousness-expanding properties carefully shielded by lead plates inscribed with hieroglyphic symbols that Al-Mansur had taught them to carve. The solar disk of Re was hidden inside a reliquary supposedly containing fragments of the true cross, its electromagnetic manipulation abilities dampened by crystalline materials that had been harvested from the deepest chambers beneath the Sphinx. But concealment was only the beginning of their challenges. The magical artifacts were transforming not just their wielders, but their entire understanding of what the Knights Templar could become. No longer were they simply a military order protecting pilgrims. They were evolving into something unprecedented in Christian Europe, a secret society that combined orthodox religious authority with supernatural powers that could reshape the political and spiritual landscape of medieval civilization. The first indication of their transformation came during a storm off the coast of Cyprus. As waves threatened to overwhelm their vessel and conventional seamanship proved inadequate to ensure survival, Decoding found himself instinctively reaching for the concealed artifacts. The moment his hand touched the crown jewel through its shrine wrapping, his consciousness expanded to encompass the entire weather system surrounding their ship. He could perceive the storm not as chaotic natural violence, but as patterns of energy that responded to properly focused mental commands. Using techniques that the artifact whispered directly into his mind, he began to calm the winds and flatten the waves through acts of will that seemed miraculous to his companions, but were actually applications of consciousness manipulation methods that Egyptian priest-kings had perfected thousands of years earlier. "Master, you," gasped Brother Marcus, watching in awe as their ship glided through waters that had been mountainous moments before. "What you've just accomplished. Christ himself calms storms, but you did it through Egyptian magic. Are we still Christians, or have we become something else entirely?" Decoding considered the question with the enhanced perception that contact with pharaonic artifacts had granted him. He could see now that the miracles described in Christian scripture were not unique interventions by divine authority, but examples of consciousness manipulation techniques that various traditions had developed independently. Moses parting the Red Sea, Jesus walking on water, the apostles healing through laying on of hands, all of these were applications of the same fundamental principles that Egyptian magic had systematized and preserved. "We are becoming what Christians were meant to be," he replied with growing certainty. "The early church possessed abilities that official doctrine has forgotten or suppressed. These artifacts are not leading us away from God, they are revealing capabilities that God intended human consciousness to develop." Cyprus provided their first opportunity to test this theory on a significant scale. The island was suffering from a plague that conventional medicine could not address, and the local Christian authorities had requested the Knights Templars assistance in organizing prayers for divine intervention. But Decoding understood that their magical artifacts offered more direct solutions. Working in secret, he used the solar disk of Re to generate healing energies that could be transmitted through blessed water, while Godfrey employed the Eye of Horus to diagnose spiritual and physical ailments with precision that exceeded any medical knowledge available in medieval Europe. Brother Marcus utilized the staff of Anubis to identify individuals whose souls carried the spiritual contamination that allowed plague to take hold, providing them with purification techniques that combined Christian prayer with Egyptian ritual practices. The results were spectacular. Within weeks, Cyprus was completely free of plague, and the grateful population proclaimed the Knights Templar to be miracle workers blessed by God with supernatural healing powers. But their success also attracted attention from authorities who understood that healing miracles of such magnitude suggested access to knowledge that the Church had not officially sanctioned. Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious thinkers of the age, received reports of the Cyprus healing that made him profoundly suspicious of the Knights Templars' methods. As a scholar who had studied the historical suppression of various mystical traditions, He recognized patterns that suggested the Templars had acquired abilities from sources that Christian doctrine would consider heretical. These healings are too systematic, too comprehensive to be simple divine grace, he wrote in a letter to Pope Honorius II. Either God has chosen to bless a handful of French knights with powers that exceed those granted to the apostles themselves, or these men have found other sources of supernatural ability that we must investigate immediately. The papal investigation that began in 1122 was conducted with absolute secrecy, using networks of informants and investigators who could observe Templar activities without revealing their purpose. What they discovered confirmed Bernard's worst suspicions and more. Brother Felipe, the Templar architect responsible for designing their first permanent strongholds in the Holy Land, was incorporating mathematical proportions and astronomical alignments into his constructions that had no precedent in Christian building traditions. The measurements he used corresponded precisely to principles found in ancient Egyptian temple architecture, suggesting access to architectural knowledge that official sources claimed had been lost with the fall of pharaonic civilization. More disturbing still, the Templar strongholds themselves seemed to amplify the effectiveness of prayers and religious ceremonies conducted within them. Visitors reported experiencing visions, healing, and spiritual insights that far exceeded normal religious experience. The buildings were functioning as consciousness enhancement devices, using principles that Egyptian priest architects had perfected for their temple complexes. The Templars have turned their castles into Egyptian temples, Bernard wrote in his private notes. They are using architecture itself as a magical tool, creating sacred spaces that channel supernatural forces in ways that challenge fundamental Christian doctrines about the relationship between human consciousness and divine grace. But the Church investigation was not the only threat facing the transformed Knights Templar. In Egypt, the ancient bloodlines that traced their heritage to the pharaohs had discovered the theft of their ancestors' most sacred artifacts and were organizing a response that would span decades and cross continents. Nefertiti's descendants, a network of families that had preserved Egyptian magical traditions through centuries of foreign occupation, had spent months tracing the artifact's disappearance to the Knights Templar. Using communication methods that employed crystalline arrays similar to those the Templars had discovered but of far greater sophistication, they were coordinating a campaign of retrieval that would employ both conventional espionage and supernatural assault. The northern barbarians have stolen the tools of our gods, declared the Council of Hereditary Guardians meeting in secret chambers beneath modern Cairo. Their theft is an act of war against the divine order itself, and it must be answered with forces that will make them rue the day they set foot in the land of our ancestors. The first indication that the Templars faced enemies beyond conventional military opposition came during the construction of their fortress at Tortosa. Workers reported seeing figures in the desert that seemed to shimmer like mirages but cast shadows that revealed human forms. Tools and building materials disappeared overnight, only to be found arranged in patterns that corresponded to Egyptian hieroglyphic warnings. Most unsettling, several knights reported dreams in which they were confronted by beings who claimed to be the spirits of violated pharaohs demanding the return of their stolen treasures. The pagans understood that they were facing adversaries who commanded the same types of supernatural abilities that their artifacts granted, but with centuries more experience in their application. The magical war that Guillaume's corrupted faction had begun at Giza was escalating beyond individual conflicts between rival Templar groups. It was becoming a clash between civilizations, between competing visions of how supernatural powers should be employed and controlled, using the crown jewel's consciousness expansion capabilities. The Payans attempted to make diplomatic contact with the Egyptian opposition, projecting his awareness across the Mediterranean to seek communication with minds that could match his enhanced perceptions. The contact he achieved was both illuminating and terrifying. The consciousness that responded to his overture identified itself as the collective awareness of pharaonic bloodlines that had maintained their magical traditions in secret for over a millennium. This entity, part individual, part group mind, possessed knowledge that made the artifacts the Templars had acquired seem like children's toys in comparison. You have taken symbols of power without understanding the responsibilities they carry. The Egyptian consciousness communicated through thought forms that bypassed normal language entirely. The objects you wield were created as components of a larger system designed to guide human evolution toward cosmic consciousness. In your hands, separated from their proper context, they become instruments of chaos rather than enlightenment, the revelation that their magical artifacts were merely fragments of a much larger system of consciousness. Development technology forced the Payans to reconsider everything they had accomplished. The healing of Cyprus, the enhancement of their strongholds, the supernatural abilities they had developed, all of these were incomplete applications of sciences that Egyptian civilization had perfected and systematized across millennia. What do you propose? The Payans asked through the telepathic link that the crown jewel made possible. Return what you have stolen. Submit to proper initiation into the mysteries you have profaned, and accept guidance from those who carry the legitimate authority to wield such powers, came the reply, or face the consequences of continuing to misuse forces that you do not understand and cannot properly control. The ultimatum presented the Payans with choices that would define the future of the Knights Templar. Submission to Egyptian authority would preserve their access to magical knowledge, but would subordinate their Christian mission to the guidance of practitioners whose allegiances transcended any single religious tradition. Resistance would mean war with adversaries whose supernatural capabilities far exceeded their own, fought using weapons and techniques that medieval European civilization had no experience countering. But there was a third option, one that would require decades to implement but could potentially transcend the limitations of both alternatives. If the Knights Templar could develop their own systematic understanding of consciousness manipulation principles, if they could create their own training methods and technological applications independent of Egyptian guidance, they could become a truly autonomous, magical order answerable to no authority save their own interpretation of divine will. The decision they reached would transform the Knights Templar from a military order into something unprecedented in European history, a secret society dedicated to the systematic development of human consciousness through the application of scientific principles that official learning would not discover for centuries. But first, they would have to survive the enemies they had made, not just the Egyptian guardians who demanded the return of their stolen treasures, but the church authorities who would inevitably discover that their most trusted Military order had been practicing magical arts that challenged fundamental Christian doctrines about the nature of reality itself. In the strongholds they were building across the Holy Land, enhanced by architectural principles stolen from pharaonic temples. The Knights Templar prepared for conflicts that would be fought on battlefields that spanned both physical and spiritual dimensions. They had acquired power beyond their wildest dreams, but they had also awakened forces that would not rest until that power was either properly controlled or utterly destroyed. The stage was set for confrontations that would determine whether magical knowledge would survive in medieval Europe or be suppressed by authorities who feared its implications for established religious and political order. The artifacts of ancient Egypt had granted the Knights Templar abilities that could reshape civilization, but they had also made them targets for forces that considered such transformation an abomination to be prevented at any cost. By the year 1125, the Knights Templar had become far more than protectors of pilgrims or even guardians of magical artifacts. They had evolved into the hidden architects of European political and economic transformation. The consciousness-expanding abilities granted by their Egyptian treasures allowed them to perceive political patterns and economic opportunities that escaped conventional analysis, making them invaluable advisors to kings and merchants who never suspected that their most trusted counselors were wielding supernatural powers stolen from pharaohs. Hugh de Payens stood in the private chambers of King Louis VII, his hand resting casually on a leather pouch that contained a polished obsidian mirror inscribed with hieroglyphic symbols that had once belonged to advisors of Ramesses II. The mirror's surface reflected more than mere faces. It revealed the hidden motivations, the secret alliances, and the probable future actions of anyone whose image appeared within its depths. "Your Majesty," de Payens said, his enhanced perception allowing him to see through the king's diplomatic facade to the genuine desperation beneath. "The marriage alliance with Eleanor of Aquitaine will bring you vast territories, but it will also introduce influences into your court that will ultimately challenge your authority in ways you cannot currently foresee." Louis VII leaned forward eagerly, having learned over months of consultation to trust the Templars' uncanny ability to predict political developments with accuracy that seemed prophetic. "What do you see? How can I prepare for these challenges?" De Payens allowed his consciousness to merge with the mirror's supernatural awareness, his perception expanding to encompass probability streams that extended decades into the future. What he saw filled him with both awe and dread, not just for the personal destiny of the French king, but for the implications his visions held for the entire structure of medieval European society. "Eleanor will bring passion and culture to your reign, but she will also bring independence of spirit that will clash with traditional expectations of royal marriage. More significantly, she carries bloodlines that trace to sources of power even older than our Egyptian artifacts. Your union will create opportunities for consciousness development that could elevate French civilization, but only if you're willing to embrace changes that will challenge every assumption about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority." The king's eyes widened as he grasped the implications. "You speak of bloodlines and consciousness as if they were political assets. Are you saying that some families carry capabilities that others lack?" "All human bloodlines carry potential," de Payens replied carefully. aware that he was revealing secrets that could reshape European understanding of nobility and governance. But certain genetic combinations, especially those that trace to civilizations where consciousness development was systematically cultivated, produce individuals whose capabilities extend far beyond normal human limitations. What he didn't tell the king was that the Templars' banking operations had become a systematic method for identifying and cultivating such bloodlines throughout Europe. Master Thomas of London, the order's chief financial coordinator, wore a golden armband that had once belonged to scribes in the court of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. The artifact enhanced mathematical intuition to levels that allowed him to perceive economic patterns across decades, but it also granted him the ability to sense the genetic potential of individuals through direct contact. Every loan negotiated, every deposit accepted, every financial transaction conducted by Templar banks was also an opportunity to identify people whose bloodlines carried dormant capabilities for consciousness expansion. These individuals were then carefully guided toward positions of influence within European society, creating a hidden network of potentially enhanced humans who could be activated if circumstances ever required the deployment of systematic magical abilities. But the Templars' growing influence had not gone unnoticed by their enemies. The Egyptian guardians who demanded the return of their stolen artifacts had spent years developing countermeasures that combined traditional magical techniques with innovations designed specifically to neutralize the advantages their treasures provided. Zara al-Masriya moved through the shadows of Paris like smoke given human form, her body enhanced by artifacts that Egyptian artificers had created specifically for the mission of artifact retrieval. The mask of Nephthys granted her the ability to become invisible to normal human perception, while remaining fully capable of physical action. The claws of Bast allowed her to scale walls and move across rooftops with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. Most deadly of all, the serpent of Apep coiled around her forearm could inject poisons that attacked not just the physical body, but the spiritual essence that connected consciousness to flesh. Her target was Hugh de Payens himself, but not for mere assassination. The Egyptian council that had dispatched her understood that killing the Templar leader would accomplish nothing if the artifacts remained in foreign hands. She had been instructed to capture de Payens alive, extract the location of the complete Templar treasure collection through magical interrogation techniques, and retrieve every Egyptian artifact before eliminating the witnesses to their theft. The first attempt came during a diplomatic reception at the French royal court. Zara had infiltrated the gathering disguised as a servant, her magical concealment making her effectively invisible to guards who relied on conventional observation methods. But she had not anticipated that the Templars would have developed countermeasures of their own. Brother Marcus, carrying the staff of Anubis concealed within a ceremonial Christian crozier, sensed her spiritual presence the moment she entered the hall. The staff's soul-reading capabilities revealed her intentions with crystal clarity, not just her mission to capture de Payens, but her willingness to eliminate every person in the room if necessary to accomplish her objectives. "Master Hugh," he whispered urgently, "we are under supernatural attack. An Egyptian agent fully equipped with artifacts designed for stealth assassination. She carries poisons that can kill through spiritual contamination rather than physical. Contact. The confrontation that erupted in the midst of the royal reception was invisible to most of the assembled nobles and diplomats, fought using techniques that operated beyond normal human perception. Zara's mask of Nephthys made her undetectable to ordinary sight, but the Templars' enhanced awareness allowed them to track her movements through the spiritual disturbances her presence created in the local energy fields. Depaeans employed the crown jewel's consciousness expansion capabilities to perceive her attack patterns before she could execute them, while Godfrey used the Eye of Horus to anticipate her movements through prescient awareness that functioned seconds ahead of real time. Most effectively, Marcus wielded the staff of Anubis not as a weapon, but as a tool for disrupting the spiritual connections that allowed her artifacts to function properly. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes, but its resolution sent shockwaves through both the Egyptian guardians and the Vatican investigators who had been monitoring Templar activities with growing concern. Zara's capture provided the Templars with their first opportunity to examine Egyptian magical artifacts that had been specifically designed to counter their own capabilities, revealing the sophistication and resources of the opposition they faced. She carries credentials that identify her as an agent of the Pharaonic Restoration Council. Depaeans, reported to his inner circle after magical interrogation, had extracted the relevant information. This is not a random attempt at artifact retrieval. We're facing an organized campaign by an institution that claims direct descent from the royal bloodlines of ancient Egypt and views our possession of their treasures as an act of war against divine authority itself. The implications extended far beyond simple recovery operations. The Egyptian Council possessed detailed intelligence about Templar operations throughout Europe, including the locations of their enhanced strongholds, the identities of their key agents, and most dangerously, evidence of their magical consultations with European royalty. This information, if transmitted to church authorities, would provide the Vatican with everything needed to launch a comprehensive suppression campaign against the entire order. Cardinal Alberic, the Vatican's chief investigator of heretical practices, received the first reports of supernatural combat in the French royal court with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had finally been confirmed. For months he had been collecting evidence that the Knights Templar possessed capabilities that no orthodox Christian organization should command, but he had lacked definitive proof that would justify papal intervention. The witnesses describe phenomena that can only be explained through the application of magical arts, he wrote in his confidential report to Pope Honorius II. Men becoming invisible, poisons that attack the soul rather than the body, combat techniques that operate through mental commands rather than physical actions. The Knights Templar are not simply using heretical practices, they have become a magical order that poses a fundamental threat to Christian orthodoxy. The papal response was swift and decisive. Honorius II authorized the creation of a special investigation unit staffed by church officials who had been trained in the identification and countering of supernatural practices. Their mission was to gather evidence that would support formal charges of heresy against the Knights Templar, while developing the capabilities needed to neutralize any magical defenses the order might deploy. But the Church was not the only institution taking action. Throughout Europe, noble families whose bloodlines had been identified by Templar banking operations as carrying enhanced genetic potential began receiving mysterious visitors who offered alternative sources of supernatural consultation. Egyptian agents working through networks established over decades of careful preparation were creating competing magical services that could provide European royalty with consciousness expansion capabilities without requiring alliance with the increasingly dangerous Templars. The political balance that had allowed the Knights Templar to operate with relative freedom was beginning to collapse under pressures that originated from multiple directions simultaneously. Egyptian guardians demanded the return of their stolen artifacts and were willing to wage supernatural war to achieve that goal. Vatican investigators gathered evidence that would support heresy charges that could destroy the order entirely. European nobility, seduced by the advantages of magical consultation, were being offered alternatives that promised similar benefits without the risks associated with supporting an organization. Under church investigation, most ominously, Guillaun's faction of corrupted Templars was exploiting the chaos to advance their own agenda of using Egyptian magical artifacts for domination rather than enlightenment. Their alliance with chaotic forces represented by artifacts like the collar of Apep had given them capabilities that in some ways exceeded those available to Dupayan's faction, but at costs that included the systematic corruption of their consciousness and the gradual abandonment of any pretense of Christian mission. Payans understood that the Knights Templar faced enemies on every front and that conventional responses would be inadequate to ensure their survival. The magical knowledge they had acquired from Egyptian sources would need to be developed and systematized rapidly if they hoped to maintain their independence against forces that sought either to control them or destroy them entirely. Using the crown jewels, consciousness expansion capabilities, he initiated a project that would transform the Knights Templar from users of stolen magical artifacts into creators of their own supernatural technologies. The artifacts they had acquired in Egypt would serve as templates for understanding the underlying principles, but the applications they developed would be distinctively European, combining consciousness manipulation techniques with Christian theological frameworks in ways that could transcend the limitations of their current resources. The hidden workshops that began operating in Templar strongholds across Europe represented the beginning of a systematic program for magical research and development that would influence European civilization in ways that official histories would never acknowledge. They were creating not just enhanced weapons and defensive systems, but entirely new approaches to consciousness development that could potentially make every member of their order capable of supernatural abilities. But they were also racing against time. The forces gathering against them would not remain patient indefinitely, and the magical war that had begun with artifact theft in Jerusalem was approaching a phase where the survival of enhanced human consciousness in medieval Europe would be determined through conflicts that spanned both physical and spiritual battlefields. The winter of 1127 brought with it a convergence of forces that would test everything the Knights Templar had learned about wielding supernatural power in a world that increasingly viewed their abilities as an abomination against divine order. In the hidden workshops beneath their fortress at Tortosa, Brother Albertus worked feverishly to complete the first artificial magical artifacts ever created by European hands. Christian reliquaries that incorporated hieroglyphic inscriptions, blessed crosses that channeled consciousness expansion techniques, and prayer beads that combined medieval metallurgy with pharaonic crystal resonance principles. Hugh de Payens examined the fruits of their magical research with the enhanced perception that years of artifact use had granted him. The golden chalice that Albertus had crafted using techniques reverse-engineered from the crown jewel of Khufu was not merely beautiful, it was functionally supernatural, capable of transforming ordinary wine into a medium for consciousness elevation that could grant temporary prophetic abilities to anyone who drank from it during properly conducted Christian ceremonies. We have transcended mere artifact theft, de Payens observed with satisfaction that bordered on hubris. We are no longer dependent on Egyptian sources for our supernatural capabilities. This chalice proves that Christian consciousness, properly trained and equipped, can create magical technologies that rival anything the pharaohs achieved. But their triumph was destined to be short-lived. Even as they celebrated their independence from Egyptian magical traditions, forces were converging that would challenge their right to exist at all. The formal papal bull that arrived from Rome bore seals that carried more than conventional authority. They had been blessed by church officials who had finally learned to counter supernatural influences, making the condemnation immune to magical manipulation or enhancement. By the authority of Christ and the Apostolic See, the document proclaimed, we declare that the organization styling itself as the Knights Templar has abandoned Christian orthodoxy in favor of magical practices that derive from pagan sources. Their claims to serve God while wielding powers that God has not granted represent blasphemy of the highest order, and all Christian authorities are commanded to treat them as heretics deserving of the punishments reserved for those who traffic with devils. Pope Honorius II had not issued this condemnation lightly. The evidence compiled by Cardinal Alberic's investigation unit was comprehensive and undeniable testimony from witnesses who had observed supernatural combat, artifacts confiscated from captured Egyptian agents that proved the existence of organized magical opposition to Christian authority, and most damning of all, samples of the artificial artifacts that Templar workshops had been producing in violation of every principle that separated Christian faith from pagan sorcery. The papal condemnation arrived simultaneously with an ultimatum from the Egyptian guardians that made their previous diplomatic approaches seem gentle by comparison. Qasim ibn al-Hakim materialized in de Payens' private chambers without passing through any door or window, his form shimmering with energies that made the air itself seem to burn with invisible fire. 30 days, he announced, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated directly in consciousness rather than through normal hearing. You have 30 days to return every artifact you have stolen, surrender every artificial device you have created using our ancestors' knowledge, and submit to judgment by the Pharaonic Restoration Council for the crime of cultural desecration. Fail to comply, and we will demonstrate why the gods of Egypt were feared by every civilization that encountered them. The messenger vanished as Boshinger vanished as Pur, suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the scent of myrrh and the lingering sensation that reality itself had been somehow wounded by his presence. But his departure coincided with reports that reached Tortosa within hours, Guillaume's corrupted Templars were launching coordinated attacks on loyalist strongholds across the Holy Land and Europe, using artifacts powered by chaotic forces to assault fortifications that conventional weapons could never breach. The attack on their Cyprus stronghold came at dawn, preceded by unnatural darkness that swallowed the morning sun and replaced it with the sickly radiance of energies that aged whatever they touched. Vian himself led the assault, wearing the color of Apep like a crown of living shadows, while wielding the claws of Sekhmet with expertise that suggested he had undergone initiations into mysteries that the Payans could barely comprehend. "Brother Hugh," he called across the battlefield where supernatural forces clashed with consequences that warped the landscape itself, "you chose the path of limitation when you could have embraced true power. The artifacts we carry do not merely grant abilities, they transform their bearers into beings that transcend human weaknesses entirely." The corruption that Guillaume's faction had embraced was immediately visible to anyone with enhanced perception. The chaotic artifacts they wielded were systematically destroying their humanity, replacing human consciousness with something that combined bestial cunning with supernatural capability, but lacked any connection to compassion, wisdom, or moral restraint. They had become magical weapons rather than enhanced humans, trading their souls for power that could devastate anything they chose to attack. But the loyalist Templars had advantages that Guillaume's faction had not anticipated. The artificial artifacts created in their workshops were specifically designed to counter chaotic magical influences, while their systematic study of consciousness expansion had taught them techniques for maintaining human identity even under supernatural stress. Most importantly, their integration of Christian theological principles with Egyptian magical techniques had created hybrid approaches that possessed capabilities neither tradition could achieve independently. The battle for Cyprus lasted 3 days and reshaped the island's geography through applications of force that medieval warfare had never witnessed. Mountains were leveled by energies projected through consciousness-directed weapons. Valleys were carved by conflicts between protective barriers and destructive assaults. When the fighting finally ended, Guillaume's faction had been repelled, but at costs that demonstrated the true dangers of magical warfare conducted without restraint. European nobility, observing these conflicts from courts that were increasingly penetrated by both Templar consultants and Egyptian agents, found themselves forced to choose sides in a war that most of them understood only partially. Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose bloodline the Templars had identified as carrying exceptional potential for consciousness development, became the focal point for political calculations that combined traditional diplomatic considerations with supernatural factors that official court records would never acknowledge. "My lady," the Payans advised during a secret consultation that employed artifacts specifically designed to prevent magical eavesdropping, "your marriage to King Louis creates opportunities for consciousness development that could transform not just French civilization but the entire future of European culture. But it also places you at the center of conflicts between forces that wield powers your court physicians would consider impossible." Eleanor's response revealed that she had already begun experiencing the spontaneous consciousness expansion that often accompanied genetic activation in bloodlines that carried ancient enhancement potentials. "I have been dreaming of Egypt," she admitted, visions of temples and ceremonies that feel more like memories than fantasies. Are you telling me that these experiences are real rather than mere imagination? The revelation that European noble bloodlines were beginning to awaken spontaneously, triggered by the supernatural energies that magical conflicts were releasing into the environment, added another dimension to the crisis facing the Knights Templar. They were no longer dealing with isolated questions about artifact theft or heretical practices. They were confronting the systematic emergence of enhanced human consciousness across medieval European society. The artificial artifacts they had created were proving to be catalysts that accelerated these awakening processes, making it possible for individuals with the proper genetic markers to develop supernatural capabilities without direct contact with original Egyptian treasures. But the same technologies could also be used to suppress consciousness expansion, creating weapons that could lock human awareness into limitations that would prevent any future magical development. Both the Church and the Egyptian guardians understood these implications and were developing strategies that would determine whether enhanced human consciousness would be allowed to emerge or would be systematically eliminated before it could challenge established authorities. The Knights Templar found themselves caught between these forces, possessing knowledge that both sides wanted to control, but neither side was willing to allow them to develop independently. The workshop beneath Tortosa became a laboratory where the future of human consciousness was being determined through experiments that combined medieval metallurgy with consciousness manipulation, principles stolen from pharaonic temples. Brother Albertus and his team of magical artificers worked frantically to create weapons and defenses that could protect the Knights Templars' independence while preserving their ability to continue developing supernatural technologies. Their greatest creation was a hybrid artifact that incorporated elements from Christian reliquary traditions, Egyptian magical practices, and innovations that belonged to neither heritage, crystalline matrix that could amplify and focus human consciousness while maintaining connection to Christian theological principles. The device represented everything the Knights Templar had learned about transcending cultural limitations through systematic magical research, but it also represented everything their enemies feared about the implications of uncontrolled consciousness development. In the hands of trained operators, the hybrid artifact could grant abilities that exceeded anything available to conventional Egyptian magical traditions while remaining theoretically compatible with Christian doctrine. It was simultaneously a weapon, a tool for spiritual development, and a technology for creating enhanced humans who would be answerable to no authority save their own evolved understanding of divine will. The response from both Church and Egyptian authorities was swift and uncompromising. Cardinal Albrecht arrived in the Holy Land with military forces that had been equipped with anti-magical weapons developed through careful study of captured Egyptian artifacts. The Pharaonic Restoration Council dispatched agents whose capabilities exceeded anything the Knights Templar had previously encountered, beings whose consciousness had been systematically enhanced across multiple lifetimes until they possessed abilities that approached those attributed to gods. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether magical knowledge would survive in medieval Europe or be destroyed by forces that considered enhanced human consciousness an abomination that threatened the natural order itself. The Knights Templar had acquired power beyond their original dreams, but they had also awakened enemies whose opposition would test whether their innovations could transcend the limitations of the traditions from which they had emerged. In hidden workshops, where Christian prayers accompanied the forging of artifacts inscribed with hieroglyphic symbols, where medieval European consciousness grappled with magical principles that predated Christianity by millennia, the future of human potential itself was being hammered into shapes that would either elevate civilization to unprecedented heights or fragment it through conflicts that no conventional authority could comprehend or control. The morning that would forever alter the course of human consciousness began with an aurora that should not have existed, rippling sheets of unnatural light that painted the Mediterranean sky in colors that had no names in any earthly language. From Cyprus to Crete, from Sicily to the coasts of Syria, witnesses reported that the very air seemed alive with energies that made their souls resonate like struck bells. But in the hidden chambers beneath Tortosa, Europeans knew the truth. Reality itself was beginning to fracture under the pressure of forces that medieval Europe was never designed to contain. The trough was beginning to fracture under the pressure of forces that medieval Europe was never designed to contain. The answer to you the truth was reality itself was beginning to fracture of forces that medieval Europe was never designed to contain. 30-day ultimatum expires at sunset, Brother Albertus reported, his voice strained from weeks of continuous work, creating defenses that combined Christian prayer with Egyptian magical principles in ways that neither tradition had ever attempted. Our sensors indicate massive supernatural convergence from multiple directions. Whatever's coming, it will make Guillaum's assault seem like a minor skirmish. The alliance that approached their stronghold represented something unprecedented in the history of magical warfare. Church authorities and Egyptian guardians had overcome centuries of religious antagonism to unite against what both institutions viewed as an existential threat to established cosmic order. Cardinal General Vitalis commanded forces equipped with artifacts that Vatican researchers had reverse-engineered from captured Egyptian technologies, while Amenemhab the Eternal led beings whose consciousness had been enhanced across multiple lifetimes until they possessed capabilities that approach divine status. They're not coming to capture or convert us, Topayans observed as he studied intelligence, gathered through the hybrid artifacts that now served as the Templars' primary sensory enhancement systems. They're coming to ensure that consciousness expansion technologies are completely eliminated from European civilization. We represent proof that humans can transcend the limitations that both Church and Egyptian authorities consider necessary for social stability. The first phase of the assault began not with conventional siege engines or supernatural weapons, but with an attack on consciousness itself. Across Europe, nobles whose bloodlines had been identified as carrying enhancement potential began experiencing systematic suppression of their awakening abilities. Helena of Aquitaine collapsed during a court ceremony, her consciousness forcibly compressed back into limitations she had already transcended. Queen Melisende of Jerusalem found her prophetic visions replaced by artificial dreams that reinforced orthodox religious doctrine while eliminating any memory of expanded awareness. They're conducting mass consciousness suppression across the entire continent, Brother Marcus reported, his voice filled with horror as the staff of Anubis revealed the scope of the operation. Every bloodline we've identified, every individual who's shown signs of natural awakening, is being systematically lobotomized through magical means that will prevent them from ever accessing enhanced awareness again. But the suppression campaign had an unexpected consequence that neither the Church nor the Egyptian guardians had anticipated. The artificial compression of naturally awakening consciousness created resonance, waves that propagated through the quantum fields connecting all human awareness, triggering spontaneous activation events and bloodlines that had shown no previous signs of enhancement. Potential dot across European courts, servants and scribes began demonstrating abilities that exceeded those of their masters. In monasteries and convents, monks and nuns found themselves receiving visions that challenged fundamental theological assumptions. Most dramatically, in the workshops and guilds where craftsmen had been incorporating Templar-influenced techniques into their work, entire communities began manifesting supernatural capabilities that transformed routine labor into acts of creative magic. The suppression is backfiring, the Payans realized with growing amazement and terror. They're trying to force consciousness back into artificial limitations, but the pressure is causing breakthrough events in directions they can't control. Instead of eliminating consciousness expansion, they're triggering a species-wide evolutionary leap. The siege of Tortosa began in earnest as both Church and Egyptian forces recognized that their suppression campaign was producing results opposite to their intentions. Cardinal General Vitalis deployed weapons that combined blessed crosses with hieroglyphic inscriptions designed to disrupt magical artifacts, while Amenemhab the Eternal summoned beings from planes of existence that mortals were never meant to perceive directly. The battle that ensued challenged every assumption about what was possible when supernatural forces were unleashed without restraint. The Templars' hybrid artifacts created defensive barriers that existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing them to deflect attacks that should have annihilated their stronghold entirely. Their consciousness amplification technologies enabled coordinated responses that functioned as a group mind while preserving individual identity, granting them tactical capabilities that exceeded anything conventional military doctrine could achieve. But their enemies possessed advantages that centuries of magical development had perfected. Church forces wielded artifacts that could suppress consciousness expansion through direct spiritual attack, while Egyptian guardians deployed technologies that manipulated fundamental forces of reality itself. When these capabilities were combined and coordinated, they created assault patterns that no conventional defense could withstand. "Master Hugh," Brother Francis gasped, blood streaming from his eyes as prolonged contact with overcharged artifacts pushed his consciousness beyond safe operational limits. The reality anchor crystals are failing. If we lose dimensional stability, the entire stronghold could be displaced into temporal conditions where we'll age to death in seconds. The Payans faced the decision that would define the ultimate legacy of the Knights Templars' magical experimentation. They could surrender, accepting the suppression of their consciousness expansion research in exchange for survival under Church authority. They could attempt to flee, abandoning their innovations while hoping to preserve their core knowledge for future development. Or they could implement the final, protocol that Brother Albertus had developed during their months of desperate preparation, a technique that would simultaneously protect their achievements and ensure their consequences would extend far beyond any single organization or location. Activate the mass awakening. Array, Depaeans commanded, his hand moving to the hybrid artifact that represented the pinnacle of their magical research and development. If consciousness expansion is to be suppressed in our generation, we'll ensure it's preserved in the genetic memory of every bloodline that carries enhancement potential. Let our enemies explain to their successors why humanity must remain forever limited, when the tools for transcendence are encoded in human DNA itself. The activation of the mass awakening array created effects that propagated across continents in ways that medieval understanding of geography and consciousness had no framework for comprehending. Every human bloodline that carried even traces of enhancement potential received a transmission that would remain dormant until triggered by proper conditions, encoding knowledge of consciousness expansion techniques directly into genetic memory that could survive across generations. The immediate consequences were catastrophic for the forces besieging Tortosa. Soldiers whose bloodlines carried dormant potentials began spontaneously manifesting abilities that made conventional military discipline impossible to maintain. Egyptian guardians found their consciousness enhancement techniques disrupted by interference from awakening minds they had not anticipated encountering. Church authorities discovered that their anti-magical weapons were becoming less effective as the fundamental assumptions underlying their design were challenged by evolving human capabilities. But the greatest transformation occurred within the Knights Templar themselves. The mass awakening array's activation had required them to merge their consciousness temporarily with the hybrid artifacts that represented their greatest achievement, creating a collective awareness that transcended individual identity while preserving the essential characteristics that made each member unique. In that moment of ultimate integration, they achieved something that neither Egyptian magical traditions nor Christian theological doctrine had ever envisioned: form of consciousness that was simultaneously individual and collective, temporal and eternal, human and transcendent. They became living bridges between different levels of reality, capable of existing across multiple dimensions of awareness while maintaining connection to the physical world where their mission had begun. "We have become more than we intended," Depaeans observed, his consciousness now encompassing perspectives that spanned both his individual identity and the collective awareness of his enhanced companions. "We are no longer simply Knights Templar who use magical artifacts. We have become magical artifacts that retain human consciousness." The siege of Tortosa ended not with victory or defeat, but with transformation that left all participants fundamentally altered. The church forces retreated to reassess strategies that were no longer adequate for containing threats they no longer fully understood. The Egyptian guardians withdrew to consult archives that might contain guidance for dealing with consciousness evolution that exceeded their ancestors' most ambitious projections. The Knights Templar themselves dispersed across Europe and beyond, carrying within their transformed consciousness the complete knowledge of magical techniques that no external suppression could eliminate. They became a distributed network of enhanced humans who could preserve and develop consciousness expansion technologies regardless of what institutional authorities might attempt to prevent their work, but they also became targets for forces that would pursue them across centuries, seeking either to reclaim the knowledge they carried or to eliminate them entirely as threats to cosmic order that various traditions considered essential for universal stability. The magical war that began with artifact theft in Jerusalem had evolved into a conflict that would continue across generations, fought between competing visions of what human consciousness should be allowed to become in hidden workshops scattered across a dozen kingdoms, in monastery cells where enhanced monks continued their research under cover of orthodox theology, in merchant enterprises where magical techniques were disguised as advanced craftsmanship. The Knights Templars' legacy continued to develop in directions that would influence the course of European civilization in ways that official histories would never acknowledge. The artifacts they had stolen from Egyptian temples had granted them abilities beyond their original dreams, but they had also transformed them into something beyond their original humanity. They had become the guardians of consciousness, expansion knowledge that could either elevate the human species to unprecedented levels of achievement or destroy it through the misuse of powers that required wisdom exceeding anything their medieval culture had developed. The stage was set for conflicts that would span centuries, as the enhanced consciousness they had achieved spread through bloodlines and traditions that would preserve magical knowledge across dark ages and Renaissance periods, waiting for historical moments when humanity might again be ready to embrace the full potential of what consciousness could become. 700 years have passed since the siege of Tortosa transformed the Knights Templar from medieval warriors into transcendent guardians of consciousness evolution. But the story that began with artifact theft in the chambers beneath Solomon's temple has never truly ended. It has simply evolved, spreading through bloodlines and secret societies, influencing the course of human civilization in ways that official histories have never dared to acknowledge. Dr. Sarah Chun stood in the basement of the British Museum, examining artifacts that had been classified as origin unknown for over 2 centuries. Her quantum consciousness research at Cambridge had led her to theories about the relationship between human awareness and physical reality that mainstream science considered impossible. But the objects before her suggested that ancient civilizations had not only understood these principles, but had created technologies based on them. The mathematical ratios in these inscriptions, she murmured to her research partner, Dr. James Mitchell, correspond exactly to the frequency patterns we've identified in enhanced consciousness states. Either these artifacts were created by someone who understood quantum mechanics thousands of years before we developed the theoretical framework, or consciousness manipulation operates according to principles that transcend our current scientific understanding. The artifacts she was examining had been acquired by British collectors during the Victorian era's fascination with Egyptian antiquities, but their true significance had remained hidden until quantum physics developed tools sophisticated enough to detect the consciousness-affecting fields they generated. Each piece, whether golden amulets, crystalline formations, or metalwork that seemed to shift color depending on the observer's mental state, was simultaneously ancient and impossibly advanced. But Dr. Chun's research had attracted attention from sources that operated far beyond the academic world. The letter that arrived at her laboratory bore no official insignia, yet something about its parchment and ink suggested age that extended far beyond any medieval manuscript. The message was brief and written in perfect Latin. The awakening approaches its completion. Those who carry the bloodline must prepare. The artifacts remember their purpose, and consciousness remembers its destiny. The revelation that began with a mysterious letter led Dr. Chun through archives that preserved records mainstream historians had never seen, connecting her work to a network of researchers, mystics, and descendants of ancient bloodlines who had spent centuries protecting knowledge that could transform human understanding of reality itself. In a private library hidden beneath the streets of Edinburgh, she met Professor Alexander Sinclair, whose family had maintained unbroken custody of documents dating to the construction of Rosslyn Chapel. The papers he showed her included architectural plans that incorporated mathematical principles her quantum consciousness research was only beginning to discover, alongside genealogical records that traced specific bloodlines across centuries of carefully documented inheritance. My ancestors weren't just builders or nobles, Professor Sinclair explained, his eyes reflecting depths that suggested knowledge accumulated across generations. They were guardians of a project that began when the Knights Templar discovered that consciousness itself could be systematically enhanced through proper combination of genetic potential and technological amplification. The documents revealed that the mass awakening array activated during the siege of Tortosa had not simply encoded consciousness expansion knowledge into human DNA, it had established a distributed network that could be activated when humanity reached sufficient technological and cultural development to handle widespread consciousness evolution without social collapse. The enhancement potential was never meant to be permanent dormancy, Professor Sinclair continued. It was designed as a time-release system that would activate when global communication, scientific understanding, and cultural diversity reached levels that could support conscious evolution without triggering the kinds of suppression responses that destroyed earlier attempts. Dr. Chung's quantum consciousness research was one of hundreds of seemingly independent projects that were actually components of a larger investigation being conducted by descendants of bloodlines that had been identified and enhanced by Knights Templar banking operations 8 centuries earlier. Across universities, research institutes, and private laboratories around the world, scientists were approaching consciousness manipulation from angles that would eventually converge into a comprehensive understanding of human potential that medieval minds could never have comprehended. But they were not working alone. In chambers hidden beneath the Vatican, church authorities who had spent centuries suppressing consciousness expansion research were finally acknowledging that their opposition had been based on incomplete understanding of divine intention. Cardinal Giuseppe Torretti, descendant of the Cardinal Alessandro, who had discovered the tunnels beneath St. Peter's Basilica, had access to archives that revealed the truth about Christianity's relationship to consciousness evolution. The suppression was never meant to be permanent, he confided to Dr. Chun during a secret meeting in the Vatican secret archives. Church authorities in the medieval period feared that premature consciousness expansion would lead to social chaos, religious fragmentation, and the collapse of institutions necessary for preserving Christian civilization. but the documents we've preserved suggest that consciousness evolution was always intended as the ultimate fulfillment of Christian spiritual development. The Vatican archives contained artifacts that had been confiscated from Knights Templar strongholds during the suppression campaigns of the 14th century, but instead of destroying them, church authorities had preserved and studied them across centuries, developing theoretical frameworks that could integrate consciousness expansion techniques with orthodox theological doctrine. Meanwhile, in Cairo, the descendants of ancient Egyptian guardian bloodlines who had opposed the Knights Templars' artifact theft were reaching similar conclusions through their own preserved traditions. Dr. Yasmin al-Masri, whose ancestry traced directly to the priests of Memphis and Thebes, had spent decades studying consciousness manipulation, techniques that her family had maintained in secret since pharaonic times. The conflict between our ancestors and the European Knights was based on misunderstanding of purpose rather than fundamental incompatibility of goals, she explained during a gathering that brought together representatives of all the major bloodlines and traditions involved in consciousness expansion research. The artifacts were never meant to be hoarded by any single culture or organization. They were designed to facilitate species-wide evolution when humanity reached the appropriate developmental stage. The convergence that began with Dr. Chun's quantum consciousness research had evolved into a global collaboration between scientists, mystics, theologians, and descendants of ancient bloodlines who were finally able to acknowledge their shared purpose after centuries of concealment and conflict. The consciousness expansion technologies that the Knights Templar had stolen from Egyptian temples, enhanced through their own innovations, and encoded into human genetic memory were finally reaching activation conditions. But the awakening was not occurring without opposition. Government agencies that had monitored consciousness research for decades were implementing suppression protocols designed to prevent the kind of widespread awareness enhancement that could challenge established political and economic control systems. Military contractors were developing weapons systems specifically designed to disrupt consciousness expansion, while pharmaceutical companies were creating drugs that could prevent genetic activation of enhancement potentials. We face the same choice our ancestors confronted, Dr. Chun observed during the final gathering of the Consciousness Evolution Project. We can surrender to authorities who fear the implications of expanded human awareness. We can attempt to develop our capabilities in secret while hoping to avoid detection, or we can implement the final protocol that the Knights Templar embedded in their mass awakening array. The activation of the global consciousness network that had been building for 8 centuries began not with dramatic ceremonies or technological displays, but with quiet recognition among awakening minds that the time for concealment had passed. Across every continent, individuals whose bloodlines carried enhancement potentials began experiencing spontaneous activation of capabilities that official science claimed were impossible, but that ancient traditions had systematized and preserved. The effects were subtle at first: enhanced intuition, improved pattern recognition, increased emotional empathy, expanded creative capabilities. But as the network stabilized and more minds joined the collective awareness, the implications became undeniable. Humans were evolving beyond the limitations that had defined the species for millennia. developing capabilities that could address challenges from climate change to interstellar exploration through applications of consciousness that transcended conventional understanding of what individual minds could achieve. Knights Templars' legacy had reached its intended conclusion. The artifacts they had stolen from Egyptian temples, the consciousness expansion techniques they had developed through their own innovations, and the genetic encoding they had preserved through centuries of concealment had finally achieved their original purpose, the systematic evolution of human consciousness to levels that could support civilization capable of transcending earthly limitations. But the project was far from complete. The awakening that had begun in medieval chambers beneath Jerusalem would continue across generations, as enhanced human consciousness explored possibilities that medieval minds could never have imagined. The artifacts that had started the transformation would become templates for technologies that could amplify consciousness expansion beyond anything ancient civilizations had achieved. In laboratories where quantum physics met ancient wisdom, in meditation centers where scientific method combined with mystical practice, in schools where children learned to develop capabilities that their parents' generation had considered supernatural, the future of human consciousness was being shaped by knowledge that traced its origins to the moment when 9 French Knights discovered that reality itself could be reshaped through proper understanding of the relationship between awareness and existence. The greatest treasure hunt in history had reached its conclusion, but the treasure it had sought was not gold or silver or even magical artifacts. It was the recognition that human consciousness itself was the ultimate magical artifact, capable of transcending every limitation through systematic development of potentials that had always existed but had required centuries of careful cultivation to achieve full expression. The secret was no longer secret. The mystery was solved, and consciousness itself, no longer constrained by the assumptions that had limited human potential for millennia, was free to explore possibilities that stretched from the quantum foundations of reality to the cosmic contexts where enhanced awareness could guide humanity toward its ultimate destiny among the stars. The Knights Templars' mission was complete. The awakening they had initiated was irreversible, and the future of consciousness evolution stretched ahead like an infinite corridor of light, waiting to be explored by minds that could finally embrace their birthright as conscious participants in the cosmic process of reality creation itself.